On today's episode, we are diving into the book titled Narratives, Stories That Hold Women Back at Work. And I have the pleasure of having the author, none other than Mette Johansson, with me today. Welcome, Mette.
Thank you, Senela. It's a pleasure being here with you today.
Oh, Mette, the minute you got your book out, I went and grabbed it. I grabbed myself a copy. I am loving it. I'm so glad that you identified that we need to have a book like this out there in the world. So thank you for that. And with that, Mette, I really want to dive in because I've got lots of interesting questions. I want my global audience to really hear from you, the author, what this book is all about. So Mette, tell us, what is this book about?
It is about these narratives that we tell each other. We tell them and retell them over and over again without thinking, what is it that we're saying? It is narratives such as women are too emotional and that's why they can't be in leadership positions, or women cannot work together. You might have heard that. We might even have said it ourselves that, oh, women cannot work together. What is that nonsense that we're repeating? A lot of it doesn't have one single bit of truth in it. And others, well, they might be old stories. There might be some cases where it's true or not. The world is changing. Let's shatter these narratives.
Love it, absolutely. And you're so right about narratives. They do hold a sense of power and influence over our life, whether we want it to or not. And that really leads me to my next question. What inspired you, Mette, to write this book now?
A lot of the diversity and inclusion work that we've been doing over the past few years has been very much about awareness. And we need to go a step further. It needs to be action. We've been speaking about this topic for years. International Women's Day is, for me, a little bit of a sad milestone because I'm having the same conversations over and over and over again every single year. Quotas or not quotas. Let's start with some action instead of discussing those same topics every single year of how do we have more inclusion, what are biases. Let's have some action. So this book, it is of course also increasing the awareness about what are these narratives that we are sharing all the time, but also what are the facts and how can we shatter these? How can we argue against these narratives? And also even some of the skills that are needed for those who might not have the character, personality, or courage to speak up. Sometimes it's difficult to say something when we are being told, oh, you're too emotional. What do you say if it's a senior person who says that? And those are some of the skills that I'm addressing in the book as well. Not just having the narratives that sometimes can be very entertaining, but also what are the arguments, what are the facts, and what are the skills you need to stand up against these things.
I love that. And another thing I want to appreciate about the book is that this piece sort of brings everything together because as I read your book, Mette, it was so refreshing and insightful at the same time. These are women from different parts and fractions. They're bringing in their stories to one central location. And I can only imagine, especially if we're, talking about an emerging female leader, she'd want to grab your book and just be like, hey, I'm not alone. There is a narrative like this. Let's call it out. That's what you do clearly in your book. And let's start those conversations. And please, let's not make these conversations repetitive, like you rightfully said, because these are conversations we've been having for years now. So I'm just wondering, Mette, what would be a very meaningful story that you would like to highlight today for my audience?
One of the stories that connects with most women is what I already mentioned, that women are too emotional. And I had an interview with a chief human resource officer from India. When she heard this chapter of my book, she said, women too emotional? You should see the boys in the boardroom. When they don't get their way, they will slam their fist on the table, they will jump up, they will shout. Women too emotional? And I believe that a lot of us can relate to it very much. I get a lot of women who get very emotional when they react against it. Because yes, what is wrong with being emotional? We're not robots. It's okay to be emotional. And worst of all, we give men the permission to be emotional at work. Men can be angry at work, and we brush it off with, oh, he's just being a little bit tempered today. He's in a bad mood. Oh, that's just Jack. That's just John. We brush it off when it's men. And when you think about it, this is exactly what I want to do with this book. Think about what it is that we're saying. When we take a step back and think about anger is a negative emotion. It affects us negatively and it affects others negatively. Whereas the emotions that women are being accused for are usually being too passionate and described as hysterical. It is about women being too passionate, or maybe a little bit frustrated about things not going the way they want it. And being passionate is a positive emotion. It can be very contagious. If somebody is passionate, at least I am very convinced that this person is going to do a great job. And I might also be passionate if somebody else is showing some passion. With frustration, the tear that women are also accused of, usually that's not directed at the person who's sitting across from the person with the tear. Usually this is more about, oh, I didn't manage to succeed. I didn't manage to do what I wanted to do. So it's more about my emotions, about myself. It's inward directed. We can channel it to something positive by doing it better next time. So why is it that the negative emotion of anger is accepted at the workplace, and the ones that have neutral impact on others or a positive impact on others, why is that that's being accepted? Those are some of the ironies, and that's where we need to really change the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for unpacking that because it really did get me reflective, Mette. As you know, Women Empower Global, like we do a lot of work in the space of women in leadership, and I know you do so much of wonderful work in that space as well. And what your book really resonated with me in so many ways was also because it's sort of reminding us that on the one end we talk about these narratives and stories that get passed down to us generationally, but then on the other hand there's also this sort of almost internal belief system of sorts, and then the stereotyping comes into play. And then I wanted to ask you a question about what influence do you think the stereotyped version of an effective leader plays with these narratives? Because one of the things I'm thinking is they say, oh, leadership means you have to be bold. You can't speak too soft. But then again, there are numerous, leaders out there who might not necessarily come with a fist to the boardroom, but they can make an impact and they're effective. So also sort of breaking down and challenging the status quo when it comes to how we idealize what a leader ought to sound like, look like, feel like. And then I'm bringing that back to your book on the narratives, because I can see some sort of a correlation there. So as I'm sharing this, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on this as well.
What comes to mind is a conversation I had with a very senior female leader. We were having lunch, and at some point of time, I addressed what you're saying. Well, is leadership seen as gender neutral in your company? Her response was, we've looked into that several times, and that's all good. It's checked. And a little bit into our conversation, she said, oh, yes, and I do believe that women lead differently. Like, for instance, we bring a lot of patience to the table, which is a contrast to the guy slamming the fist on the table and shouting, right? So it fits very nicely with the story that I heard from another person. Anyway, back to her story, to the lunch I was having and an interview I was having with a senior female leader. When she said, yes, women bring patience to the table, I asked her, is that also reflected in your leadership principles? And that's when she went, you got me there. So even when we think that we are checking our systems, we are checking our processes, we're checking our culture for gender bias, for diversity and inclusion, we're not always getting it right. There's so many things that are so deeply ingrained in us, and we need to think about it very critically. Everybody, by the way, not just women, or just not just men, I should say, also the women, as in this case, that was a female leader who realized that she was also not being 100% gender neutral in her evaluation of gender neutrality in her own company. Another very good example where it's also showing that women are affected is one of the narratives I describe is about women are not interested in a career. And I get this even from women in leadership courses. You're doing this, I'm doing it. I have a session where I talk about the big, audacious goal. What is your big, audacious, ambitious, big, hairy goal? And I always have a couple of women in the room who will say, I'm not really ambitious, or I'm quite happy where I'm at. What's interesting is, for some reason, the very first time I heard this response, I said, what if you were a man? What would your big, audacious goal be if you were a man? The person in the room picked up her pen and started writing her big career plans down on her paper. And this to me shows that it is so embedded in us that women don't really want that career. For her, it was maybe because, in leadership positions, you need to work harder, you need to work more hours. That's one limiting belief, that I need to work more and I want to take care of my family, so I can't work those longer hours. Or maybe it is, I have to be involved in politics, I don't want to do that. Or I can spend less time with the family. Whatever the reasons are, women are also holding themselves back. They are limiting their thinking with limiting beliefs, because all of this is not just in the minds of one gender. We all are telling ourselves these stories. And that is what we need to focus on more, that these are stories and there's not really much truth in any of these.
I love that. And also, it's not just for women, like you said, it's also for men, because even men, when we think about narratives and self-limiting beliefs, it really doesn't have a gender, right? It's applicable to everybody. But the minute you get more nuanced, you have this beautiful precision, then you can go nip it at the bud and be like, this is where transformation can happen, because now we have a focus, right? So I'm just wondering, the book narratives, coming back to this book, is it only for women, or I'm wondering, can men read it as well?
I wish that a lot more men would read it as well. Getting men to read it is the big challenge. Of course, everybody needs to read it, because we can't do the gender balance thing all on our own. It has to be involving all genders. Women cannot fight the battle alone. And by the way, that's a very gender colored sentence right there. Fight is very masculine, right? We can't do this on our own. We need to have allies. We need to do this together. It's very challenging to get men interested in these conversations. I was booked for a podcast on my new book, and in the end, we changed the conversation from narratives to authentic leadership, which is the topic that I also do a lot of research on. I've been working with for 10 years. I write my next book on this topic, but I was booked on speaking about narratives, the stories that hold women back. And in the end, it wasn't even mentioned. We were talking about authentic leadership. Why? Because part of his audience is male, probably a large part of the audience, and he doesn't want to make it irrelevant for these people. So yes, it is challenging to get men interested. And it's also because men either think, oh, I'm already very woke, or whatever you would say today. I'm an ally, I'm promoting women, I don't need this. Or they're, why is this needed? Women are already having all the opportunities in the world. We don't need to do more. Women are being promoted left, right, and center. Why do we need all of this? So those are the two stereotypical groups you have amongst men. And as a result, they don't necessarily think that this is relevant for them.
Yes, it's so interesting. Mette, thank you for sharing your perspectives today. I just love getting into your mind and having a little sense into how you're thinking and your experience in this topic, and really producing this book for the world. Once again, I'm congratulating you. I think it's wonderful, the work you're doing, and also with this book. And I'm so excited for the next book as well, that you said that that's going to be coming out. And with that, I'm just wondering, as we come to a close today on today's show, Mette, what would be your advice for our global audience today on what they can do when encountering these narratives?
One thing that is essential is to have conversations around this. And I like the expression of calling people in to a conversation rather than calling people out. Calling people out seems like you did something wrong, you're a misogynist, or whatever nasty things we can say. That's not going to help. It's going to make people defensive. You're not going to have a very constructive conversation with somebody that you're calling out. Meaning it's rather about calling in to conversations so that we, in a diplomatic way, raise what is it that we are saying here, bringing the facts across, and of course, making sure that we are having some arguments in favor of shattering the narratives. It is about calling people in. Now, what I spend time in my book doing is also to share some conversation techniques. Asking questions is often a very good way of calling people into a conversation. Would you have said the same if she were a man, for instance? For instance, when you're dismissing a woman, she's not interested in that job because she doesn't want to be traveling, because she has children, whatever it is that we're saying, she won't be interested in a career. Have you asked her? Or would you say the same if she was a father, if he were a father with small children? So asking questions is a very good way of calling people in. Of course, it depends on your tonality. Would you really say the same if she were a man? Then that's a different tonality. If we're calling people in open-ended, neutral, non-judgmental questions, that is a good starting point for a conversation. Even better, and this is where we need all genders, even better is if it's a man who is observing what is going on, and if the man steps in. Because often when you are involved, if somebody is telling you something that is triggering you, for instance, oh, you're so emotional. Who doesn't react emotionally when you're getting accused of being emotional? I definitely do. I get emotional when you tell me, oh, don't be so emotional. It's much better for somebody who is not directly involved to stand up, speak up, and say something. Would you say the same if you were speaking to a man? That is the way forward, making sure that we have those conversations. We're calling people in rather than calling people out. And of course, that we're involving a lot of people who are bystanders, having more allies to speak up for us. That would be a great way forward. Some people, I must say, they can just go ahead and say, hey, are you really aware of what you're saying right now? Some people are very good at that, and they also have the personality to do so. And if you, dear listener, are one of those, keep on doing that. If you get away with that, I know several people who are awesome at simply telling their opinions in a very blunt way. Good on you. Continue doing it. If you're one of the many who doesn't feel so comfortable about having these conversations, then asking questions. I've of course written the book with the gender topic in mind. Now, it is very relevant for all aspects of diversity and inclusion. One of the things that I like to say in my workshops is that inclusion is not a menu where you can choose, okay, I want women and today I want that ethnicity, but I don't want the other ethnicity. That's not how it's going to work. Inclusion is about respecting anybody, whatever their backgrounds, whatever their diversity labels, I don't like the term, but whatever your demographics, whatever your identity is, it is about including everybody, realizing that we are all adding value, respecting people for the value that they add as individuals, regardless of background. And I do want to stress that this is for all genders. It is not about men or women not speaking up. It is a topic that's relevant for everybody. We all need to be more aware, and we all need to be speaking up more about this topic. It is about addressing the narratives regardless of your gender.
Love that advice, and an awesome tip to conclude today's episode, Mette. It's been such an absolute joy to have you. Thanks for coming on the show today, and we look forward to having you in our network. Thanks, Mette. Wishing you more and more coming your way.
Thank you so much for having me, Senela. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.